Just before we get into the episode today, quick word from our fantastic sponsor, Saily. Have you ever landed in a country and then you're like, okay, well, I got to get myself a SIM card because I don't want to get absolutely destroyed on mobile charges, which has happened to me, and it's a bad thing. It didn't happen way worse to a friend of mine about 20 years ago. Went to America, was like, yeah, no, I can use the internet. It seems to work. £500. £500 bill for that holiday. And that was 20 years ago. Very expensive stuff. That's where Saily comes in, and they're the sponsor today. Saily is an eSIM app that works in over 190 countries. You download it once, install the eSIM on your phone, and that's it. No need to swap anything out or install a new one in each country. It's cheaper than roaming, it saves you from dodgy SIM card stalls, and it even blocks ads to help reduce data usage. There are global and regional plans if you hop in countries, and the whole thing works on iOS and Android. It just works, and it's super. I've used a similar service in the past, and it wasn't as easy. You kind of got to change it around all the time. And this is just like, hey, okay, good to go. Thank you. Get 15% off your Saily data plan with the code SHADOWS. Just download the app or go to saily.com/shadows. Again, that's code SHADOWS for 15% off. And now today's video. They came from around the world. Clients, guides, seasoned climbers, each chasing the same dream, to stand on the highest point on Earth. But by the evening of May the 10th, 1996, Mount Everest had turned that dream into a waking nightmare. Trapped high in the death zone with storms closing in and oxygen running out, some would make it back, but others never would. In total, 8 climbers died over the course of just 2 days, some just meters from safety. It was the deadliest single incident in the mountain's history up to that point, and a turning point in how the world viewed high-altitude adventure. The fallout was swift, finger-pointing, soul-searching, and a media frenzy that would see the events dissected in books, documentaries, and films. But beyond the headlines was something more intimate, a slow-motion disaster where the difference between survival and death came down to timing, luck, and decisions made under impossible strain. Nearly 3 decades on, the questions have not gone away. This is not just the story of a storm, but of human limits, and what happens when ambition climbs too high, too fast. Nepal's Mount Everest towers into the sky, its summit at 8,849 meters, reaching a place so high that the upper atmosphere is nicknamed the Death Zone because it doesn't have enough oxygen. In May 1996, the peak was swarming with climbers from various expeditions, all vying for a chance to stand on the top of the world. Among them were 2 high-profile guided teams, one from Adventure Consultants, led by New Zealander Rob Hall, and another from Mountain Madness, led by American Scott Fisher. Both Hall and Fisher were celebrated mountaineers at the time. Hall had just completed his 5th Everest ascent, more than any other non-Sherpa climber, and by 1996 he had guided 39 people to the top. His company charged a hefty fee of around $65,000 per client, but was renowned for its safety and success rate. Fisher, equally respected, had summited Everest without supplemental oxygen in 1994 and was known for his bold, energetic approach to climbing. Hall was so confident in his success that he had even brokered a deal with Outside Magazine to bring journalist John Krakauer on his team in exchange for publicity. Along a similar vein, Fisher's group also included socialite Handy Pittman, whose presence brought yet more media attention. Also joining them was a Taiwanese team, and on the other side of the mountain, the northern side, an expedition from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. This, by Everest standards at least, all served to make the route rather crowded. Not that this fact put anyone off or lessened any spirits, mind you. As for how things got started, that was actually way before the fateful day in question, as both Hall and Fisher's teams had spent weeks acclimatizing to and moving up the mountain. By the 9th of May, they'd reached Camp 4, the final camp at the South Col, roughly 7,900 meters up, which meant that soon it would be time to go for the final push. This also placed them, quite intentionally, just below the death zone, the perilous region above 8,000 meters where the air is so thin that the human body begins to shut down, making prolonged exposure a slow and certain death without supplemental oxygen. But it gets worse, because altitude alone is far from the only concern one faces when making the perilous final push to the top of the world. There's also the weather to consider, and on that day, many of the climbers were concerned. Lucas Ishk, a member of Hall's expedition, was one such individual. As far as he was concerned, the very strong winds that had started hitting Camp 4 on the morning of the 9th alone were caused to give the final ascent a day or two. Hall listened to his concerns, but reminded him that there was never an ideal time to make the final push. They only had a limited window to work with. The spring climbing season lasts from March to May, and so they simply had to wait for the safest window of opportunity within that time frame. Otherwise, they'd all just end up twiddling their thumbs until the end of May hit, at which point they'd be heading back down whether they liked it or not. A fat wad of cash burnt and no photo at the summit to show for it. He was confident that they were nearing that window of opportunity, however. Meteorologists were warning that a rather severe storm was brewing that would come to a head on the 11th. But the 10th appeared as though it would be clear. Even better, that gale wind that had gotten Lou so concerned also appeared to be waning. And so it was that Hall made the call at 8 p.m. on the 9th, resulting in his party being summit-bound before the stroke of midnight. This rationale was shared by the other party leaders as well, meaning that when all was said and done, a total of 33 climbers were making for the top on that fateful day. Now, immediately, things got off to a real difficult start. Shortly after midnight, the delays just started to stack up. The first came when climbers reached a steep section called the balcony, roughly 8,350 meters up. There, they discovered that the fixed ropes that should have been pre-installed were absent. Not the end of the world by any means. These things do happen as nature does its thing on the mountainside, but it did cause a delay nonetheless and created a bottleneck too, as all the previously scouted parties caught up with one another. All the while, Sherpa guides scrambled to anchor new ropes. This otherwise routine task, however, dragged on and on and on due to the sheer quantity of rope that needed to be reinstalled. Eventually, after nearly an hour had passed, two of the guides in Fisher's team, Neil Biederman and Anatoly Bukharev, stepped up to chip in. Working together, they all managed to complete the task, but it took considerable effort and had already cost the ascenders precious time. The next delay came near the famous Hillary Step, a 40-foot near-vertical rock outcrop at roughly 8,760 meters, where the climbers again found that no fixed line had been placed. Once more, they applied the brakes, clinging to the side of the world's tallest mountain, as guides and Sherpas alike worked to secure ropes, which again took the best part of an hour. Now, at this point, some climbers, realizing the morning sun was already nearing upon them and that they hadn't even made it halfway up, never mind back down, made the provenly wise decision to give up on reaching the summit and turn around. Examples included Frank Fishbeck, John Taskay, Stuart Hutchinson, and Lou, who we met earlier, all four of them being from Hall's party, incidentally. John Krakauer, the Outside Magazine journalist, commented on their choice later, stating that, faced with a tough decision, they were among the few who made the right choice that day. Emphasis on the word few there, as well, as most of the original 33 climbers pressed on toward the summit. John went on further to note how thin the line becomes between ambition and fatal misstep in the death zone once summit fever kicks in. By the early afternoon, on the 10th, some of the faster climbers finally stood on the summit of Everest, victorious, but oh so very much behind schedule. At roughly 1:07 p.m, Anatoly Bukharev, who was climbing without supplemental oxygen incidentally, was first to make it. Others followed throughout the 1 o'clock hour. First John Krakauer, then Anatoly's fellow guides Andy Harris and Neil Biederman, as well as several clients from both expeditions. However, many others were still on the way up, even as 2 p.m, the recommended safe turnaround time, came and went. And just to make things worse, those clear conditions soon started to dissipate, being replaced instead by snowfall and ominous dark clouds. Rob Hall summited around 2:30 p.m. along with a few of his clients, but instead of immediately heading down, he waited on the summit for Doug Hansen, one of his clients who was struggling upward. Hall had actually turned Hansen around just shy of the top the year before, and the determined postal worker was hell-bent on making it this time, which he did, shortly after 4 p.m. Hansen's determination to reach the summit and Hall's determination to see him succeed now put the group dangerously behind schedule. It was a similar story on Fisher's side too. He himself didn't arrive at the summit until about 3:45 p.m, badly exhausted and showing signs of altitude sickness, possibly high-altitude pulmonary edema or high-altitude cerebral edema, conditions where fluid builds up in the lungs or the brain respectively, often causing confusion, breathlessness, and, if untreated, a rapid slide toward death. Bukharev, for his part, had not lingered excessively. He spent an hour and a half helping others toward the summit, then began heading back down to Camp 4 no later than 2:30 p.m, reaching there around 2.5 hours later. Later, he explained that he did this in order to be in shape to assist others from lower down, rather than being unable to help them at all. After all, he was climbing without bottled oxygen, which left him rather vulnerable if he waited too long up high. As the climbers eventually began to trickle down from the summit en masse in the late afternoon, the weather, which had been threatening to worsen for some time, proved to be a man of its word. Between 5 and 6 p.m, a howling blizzard began to engulf the upper mountain, and visibility in the resulting whiteout plummeted. As Krakauer later described, snow pellets borne on 70-mile-per-hour winds stung their faces. The blizzard also erased the trail and buried the fixed ropes, transforming the descent into a deadly maze even before one considered the weather. Thanks to the ever-worsening conditions, Hall and Hansen soon found themselves in dire straits near the Hillary Step. Hansen's oxygen tank had run dry and he could no longer move under his own power, collapsing altogether a little later. Hall radioed for help, naturally, and stated that Hansen was unconscious but still breathing. Fellow guide Andy Harris, already fatigued and oxygen-deprived himself, gallantly turned around and climbed back up from the south summit with spare oxygen and water around 5:30. He arrived as the skies turned black, but eventually disappeared into the storm and was never seen again. Not far below, Fisher and Lopsang Jangbu, a Sherpa, were also in grave trouble. They had gotten lost during their descent, unable to find a single guideline, as the ropes remained buried under the snow and unable to get any visual point of reference thanks to the ever-darkening clouds that enveloped them. Fisher, having reached the point of total exhaustion, eventually collapsed on the slope and barely had the energy to mumble, "I am sick. I am dead," to Jangbu. Jangbu, for his part, wasn't having it, and he did all that he could to get Fisher moving again, as the bitter conditions of Everest continued battering them. In the end, after literal begging from Fisher, Jangbu reluctantly left him behind and continued his descent toward Camp 4, but not before he promised to return with a properly organized rescue party as soon as he was able. There's also a third group of descending climbers who'd lost their way. This group, guides Neil Bilderman and Mike Groom, and several clients including Beck Weathers and Yasuka Namba, wandered in the darkness, unable to locate Camp 4 or even get a decent sense of where it might be. With wind chills hovering around minus 56 Celsius, what energy they did have was fading fast. Eventually, the dozen or so climbers that made up the group huddled together in the snow, opting to try and preserve their heat and sit it out, rather than simply collapsing from exhaustion in a purgatorial search. If only they'd known they were a mere 200 meters away from Camp 4. As the night dragged on, some in the huddle grew unresponsive. Yasuku Namba, a 47-year-old Japanese businesswoman who had just become the oldest woman to summit Everest that afternoon, now lay in the snow, suffering from severe hypothermia. Next to her was Texan pathologist Beck Weathers, who was himself barely alive. Charlotte Fox, who was also in the group but just still clinging to consciousness, later recalled the terror of that night. Quoting her, "By then, the cold had about finished me off. My eyes were frozen. I didn't see how we were going to get out of it alive. I just curled up in a ball and hoped death would come quickly." Around midnight, the blizzard temporarily eased, revealing the lights of Camp 4 not far away. Sensing an opportunity, Biedlman, Groom, and a few others who could still walk stumbled onward and finally reached Camp 4. They were safe, but they had been forced to leave behind 5 people who could not move: Fox, Namba, Weathers, along with Tim Madsen and Sandy Pittman, who remained huddled together in the snow. Upon hearing the people were still out there, Anatoly Bukreev, true to his word, launched back into the storm on a one-man rescue mission. Guided only by faint cries and a dim headlamp, he managed to locate the stricken climbers in the early morning hours. One by one, he hauled Pittman, Fox, and Madsen up and helped them stagger back to Camp 4, with the last of them making it at approximately 4:30 a.m. Bukreev had wanted to save Namba and Weathers too, of course, but they were non-responsive, beyond help in the awful conditions, and he was physically spent. The crushing reality was simple. There was nothing he could do, and if he tried, despite that fact, he would just end up sharing their fate. So he made the agonizing decision to leave them behind. Dawn on May the 11th brought a lull in the storm, and the scattered survivors at Camp 4 began to take stock of the situation. A small search party set out in the early morning to look for those still missing. Expedition member Stuart Hutchinson and 2 Sherpas, Lahakpa Chiri and Ang Dorje, hiked toward the last known location of Weathers and Namba. They found both alive, barely. They were conscious, snow-caked, and gravely frostbitten. After a brief discussion, and given their own debilitated state, Hutchinson concluded that they could not be saved by the hypoxic, frostbitten team at Camp 4. With great reluctance, the would-be rescuers turned back, leaving Weathers and Namba where they lay, believing the two were beyond all hope. That belief, though, was wrong, at least partly. Amazingly, Weathers had not died overnight, despite being abandoned with his face and his hands frozen solid. Instead, rather than dying, he regained consciousness as the sun rose, and in a state of delirium stumbled upright and began walking by himself toward Camp 4. He arrived under his own power, half-blind and severely frostbitten, shocking his team, who had presumed him dead. Yasuka Namba, however, he never woke up. The aspiring 7 Summits climber had succumbed in the icy night, only a few hundred meters from safety. Up near the south summit, there was no miracle for Hall either. Remarkably, he had survived the night at nearly 8,800 meters, sheltering himself beside Hansen's lifeless body. On the fresh morning, clinging to the last shreds of his mortal being, he managed to radio down to base camp, confirming with heartbreaking calm that Hansen was gone and that Harris was also missing. Hall himself was stranded high and frostbitten, unable to descend alone, and with his condition only worsening, base camp patched his radio through to his pregnant wife, Jan Arnold, back home in New Zealand, via satellite phone. In what would be their final conversation, the pair picked out a name for their unborn daughter, before Hall then gave assurances that he was reasonably comfortable, and stated, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." And those were his last words, before he passed to exposure, right beside the client it promised not to leave. The pair's bodies were discovered high on the south summit about 2 weeks later by climbers from a subsequent expedition, but in accordance with the wishes of the surviving family, they were left where they fell, with Jan publicly stating that that was where he'd like to have stayed. Scott Fisher was also beyond saving. On the 11th, Sherpas, one of whom was Jan Bu, staying true to his word, mustered a rescue attempt and climbed back up towards Fisher's last known position. They found him barely alive and tried to give him oxygen, but they could not revive him in his dire state. With great sorrow, they had to leave Fisher's body on the mountain, but mercifully, they did find and rescue Gao Ming-ho, the leader of the Taiwanese expedition, who himself had found himself cut off and exhausted and huddled alongside Fisher for warmth. And while rescue efforts continue on the southern face of Everest, news began to filter through of a parallel disaster that had unfolded on the northern side. 3 members of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police expedition, Subadar Samanla, Lance Morup, and Tiswang Pajor, had made a summit attempt via the northeast ridge on the afternoon of the 10th. Like their southern counterparts, they were caught in the teeth of the same ferocious storm during their descent. Communication ceased, and only one climber from their group, Harbhajan Singh, would make it back to high camp alive. The others were never seen alive again. The body of one, believed to be Pao remained for years in a limestone alcove just below the summit, his bright green boots marking him to the passing world. Green Boots, as he became known, would lie there for nearly 2 decades, becoming a grim waypoint for every climber that headed for the summit. Beck Weathers was in the worst way of all the survivors, by far, and he was bearing truly grievous injuries. But despite that fact, he was heroically assisted down to low camps over the course of 2 days. In fact, guides Pete Athens and Todd Burleson from another team selflessly abandoned their own summit attempt and descended to Camp 4 to aid Weathers specifically. They, the members of an IMAX film expedition, got him down to Camp 2, and from there, a Nepali Army piloted a daring high-altitude helicopter rescue, one of the highest ever attempted to airlift Weathers to safety. He miraculously survived, though he eventually lost his nose, his right hand, halfway to the elbow, and all the fingers on his left hand to frostbite. The horror on Everest also made headlines across the globe. Up until that time, climbing disasters had rarely penetrated the public's consciousness, but in 1996, the world was watching. In no small part, beyond simply the scale of the tragedy, this being down to Krakauer, who, if you recall, was a journalist with Outside Magazine. In the aftermath, he penned a searing first-hand article and then a best-selling book, Into Thin Air, detailing the expedition's plight. Released in 1997, Into Thin Air became a publishing sensation, selling 800,000 copies in hardcover alone. By the late 90s, the tragedy was also the subject of a TV movie, countless magazine pieces, an IMAX documentary film made using footage gathered by that crew that had coincidentally been filming on the mountain when it all unfolded. Such a media frenzy was unprecedented in mountaineering history, turning the climbers into well-known public figures and sparking a broader public debate about who, if anyone, held culpability for the disaster. Central to the controversy was the portrayal of Buchreev. In Into Thin Air, Krakauer questioned Buchreev's judgment, particularly his choice to guide without supplemental oxygen and his quick descent ahead of clients, suggesting these decisions left clients vulnerable and may have cost lives. Buchreev, for his part, vehemently disagreed. His actions on Everest were in fact lauded by many in the climbing community. For example, in late 1997, the American Alpine Club awarded him its highest honor for mountaineering courage, the David A. Salles Memorial Award, for his repeated extraordinary efforts rescuing fellow climbers and his valiant attempt to save Scott Fisher at great personal risk. Further, Buchreev argued in his own memoir, The Climb, that foregoing oxygen allowed him to be stronger and better acclimatized during the emergency, and that descending early positioned him to lead rescue efforts later. This dispute became a flashpoint. Some climbers sided with Krakauer's critique of Buchreev, while others defended him as a hero who did what he could in an impossible situation. Tragically, however, the debate became a moot matter soon enough anyway, as Bukrieff was killed in an avalanche on Annapurna in December 1997, leaving many to wonder how his legacy might have been viewed if he had lived to further weigh in. Beyond all that, however, the 1996 Everest disaster also forced an entire community to reflect. The tragedy raised hard questions about the commercialization of Everest, whether guiding fee-paying amateurs to the world's highest peak had become too much of a business, leading to overcrowding and compromised safety. But it is worth noting that expedition companies did implement some changes, emphasizing far stricter turnaround times, better radio communications, and more advanced weather forecasting, for example. And as far as deterring adventurers, the well-publicized disaster actually drew more people to test themselves on Everest slopes. In the 1990s, for example, the average number of summiters in any given year hovered at around 150 to 200. By the 2000s, that had doubled and only continued to grow further still, to the point that in 2024, 1,000 climbers plus attempted it. Ultimately, however, the most important detail in today's story is the victims. In the aftermath of debate, media frenzy, and commercial scrutiny, it's easy to lose sight of the simple human cost. These were people, friends, family members, colleagues who set out in the pursuit of a dream and never came back. Over the course of just 2 days, across both the southern and northern faces of Everest, 8 climbers lost their lives. 8 names, 8 stories cut short. So let our final words today belong to them. Rob Hall, from New Zealand, the expedition leader and guide. Doug Hansen, United States, a client. Andy Harris, New Zealand, a guide. Yasuka Namba, Japan, a client and experienced mountaineer. Scott Fisher, United States, expedition leader and guide. Sewang Samanla, India, climber, Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Dorje Marup, India, climber, Indo-Tibetan Border Police. And Sewang Pajor, India, climber, Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Thank you for watching.